Good morning and welcome to Foreign Policy Research Institute's presentation on the policy implications of China's presence in Africa. I'm speaking on behalf of our president, Raleigh Flynn, who is unable to join us this morning. I will introduce our three panelists and let them take over the show. We start with Professor Carla Jones, Professor Mengge Li, and Professor Hermann Ndofor, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who will talk to us about the implications of China's heavy investment on the African continent and what that means for U.S. policy. And with that, and I am, by the way, Charles Ray, I am the chair of the FPRI Africa program, and I'd welcome all of our guests this morning. Dr. Jones, the floor is yours.
Okay, we could start our slides. There we go. The title of our presentation is The Chinese Economic Engagement in Africa. Next slide. Here's just an overview of our presentation. We want to introduce you to what led us to engage in this research, look at some trends in investing in Africa, some of the phases of Chinese economic engagement, political power shifts, our findings, and then our implications and conclusion. So the relationship between China and Africa is not new. However, it's always been asymmetric. So we want to look at a few periods of interaction. Sort of prior to 1949, there was little interaction. And this is said to be because many African nations were still under colonialism. And so there wasn't much engagement because there were a few independent countries. Between 1949 and 1976, under Chairman Mao, we experienced things like the Cultural Revolution, some visits between China and Africa that go back and forth, with some leaders coming to China, some leaders from China going to Africa to visit. There have been some 10-country visits that have solidified the relationship. At this time, in these early stages, there are also some African countries that are stronger, that have a stronger economy than than China altogether. As countries in Africa gain their independence, there's an opportunity for China to come in and to develop a stronger relationship. As we get into the early 70s, the US began normalizing relationships with Beijing, and that signaled to allies in Africa its support for Taiwan was waning. Around the late 70s, China achieved a large political victory with admission to the UN. And then China began working with African countries irrespective of their political party. Through the 70s, we see that imports from China, or that Chinese imports from Africa remain kind of stable, but the exports to Africa are consistently growing. We get to the period of 78 to 92, and China's interest in Africa sort of wanes because Africa is not open as much to international markets. However, in the early 80s, China has a global policy shift, and it signals that it's going to not have as much revenue to work with aiding countries, and there are few trips back and forth between the leaders of China and many African countries. However, then China sets the stage for a different kind of economic cooperation. It says that many African countries won't have to choose between having a relationship between the Soviet Union and Africa. And the number of African countries that recognize Beijing is starting to increase. And then China also has an inward economic focus at this time. Then we get to 1992 to 2002, and it's the end of the Cold War. There's an increase in high-level visits between the leaders of China and many African countries. Around 1989, the trade between China and Africa is about $1 billion US. And then by the time we get to 2002, it's about $10 billion. FDI from China has started to increase and become stronger. Then we get to the last period that I'll focus on, and we see stronger relationships between China and many African countries. The theme goes from a peaceful rise to peaceful development. Chinese economic well-being is at its highest, and it's a stronger priority. FDI has significantly increased, and China has built most of the existing infrastructure in Africa, and China-Africa trade goes from $10 billion in 2002 to about $180 billion in 2012.
Okay, thank you, Carla. So as Carla started mentioning, going right up to 2012, we see a significant rise in Chinese investments in Africa, both in terms of FDI and in terms of loans. And I would take 2012 to 2019 a little later, just because there's a shift there. But at the same time, if we want to compare that, we look at the US peaked in 2009 and started significantly dropping. And by the time we get to 2016, we're actually finding some net outflows, meaning companies are actually, US businesses are actually withdrawing their stock of capital more than they are investing in the continent, right? But looking at the trends by themselves sometimes doesn't give us a good picture. So what we are really interested in is understanding what implications Chinese engagement, and we're using the word economic engagement here because we want to include both the FDI and the loans. Because as we will discuss a little later, post-2012 especially, there is a strategic trade-off in the classification that makes it a little obscure when you start disentangling them to see which is a loan and which is an FDI. And FDI is when a company by itself invest, right, in another country. And so traditional economic explanations for why a country or businesses in one country invest in another have usually focused on, it's either resource seeking or market seeking. And it raises the question really of the why. But from our perspective, we thought it more interesting of the why not. If we're asking the question, why is China engaging in Africa? The question by itself is a sign of what the issues might be, right? Why should China not be in Africa? Might be another way of phrasing it. And we noticed that issues about China investing in Africa really start hitting the highline. The newspaper highlights probably 2010-11 and the peak around 2013, which really timely match the increase, not only in Chinese investment, but the decrease in the US investment. And we have two broad scopes of explanation, right? The one school that focuses on potential exploitation, right? The strategic use of debt, as one American politician called it, to hold Africa captive to Beijing's wishes, right? And then Secretary of State Clinton warns about Chinese engagement in Africa as another new form of colonialization. But on the flip side, you can ask, well, what is different from these types of investment? Almost across the globe, you find that countries invest in other countries, in other continents. North America invests in China, North America invests in Africa and Asia. Why not Africa? And the first, and when you look at it from a more Chinese-centric perspective, is, well, we invest like everybody else without the paternalistic conditions or imperialistic conditions you get when you get Western investment, right? There are no terms for democracy. There are no conditions on human rights. There are no conditions on, and I'll use quotes here, other Western values that might be enforced. But it also means, therefore, that if we look at it strictly economic, it may not be fully capturing. Is it simply for a resource acquisition, like most Western investments are? Or is it also market seeking, i.e. A market for Chinese products? And this is where we make the argument here that a lot of the research and the discussions centering around why China and how China engages in Africa kind of misses a bit of the big picture, right? When we look at it from strictly economic terms, the traditional drivers of foreign investment that we usually look at in the West, market seeking, resource seeking, may not necessarily fully apply because of different changes. But as Carla also mentioned, and we'll see some details in that, we are also thinking about it as a stationary China, but across the decades, China has never been stationary. And more importantly, China's relationship with Africa has not been stationary, right? So the argument we're making here is that at certain times, maybe the economic drivers are more dominant, but at other times, it is less likely going to be economic drivers and more likely going to be other institutional drivers. More specifically, if we go pre-2008, and I think most of us are familiar with why 2008 is significant, that's the beginning of the Great Depression, that really realigns a lot of relationships, especially economic-based. Most of why China was engaging in Africa was resource acquisition, and to a lesser extent, market seeking. And a lot of the research and some of the empirical evidence supports that. And during that time, China also rises significantly as a market power, as a leading economic power, but without necessarily fully utilizing the leverage that comes with being an economic power. With the Great Depression in 2008, with Western powers kind of looking a lot more inward, China kind of comes to age as an economic power. And when you come to age as an economic power, you realize that economic power facilitates other things, right? So, okay, economic power is not necessary just for trade and business, but, well, it is also good for politics, for diplomacy, right? So you start investing, but you start leveraging power in economics to get concessions in international relations. And concessions in international relations here meaning, well, if you think especially as how China looks at foreign policy, they generally pursue what we can consider a bloc approach, consensus approach according to blocks, right? Whether it's with BRICS, whether it's a Southeast Asia economic zone, or what you call a Shanghai Economic Agreement, where they form blocks of similar interests, refine that interest and pursue it. Usually, but not always, in opposition or in contrast to what may necessarily be a US-centric policy. Post-2012, and we note that here, that not only is the Great Depression ending, but we also see the rise of Xi as the president of China in 2013, which starts a different policy. This is where China has experimented with being an economic power and how it can utilize that economic power. And we see elements of it really fine-tuning the utilization of that economic power, right? And broader, not only in Africa, but you look outside Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative is really an exemplar of that, of how you actually fine-tune and utilize that across both economic and this political affairs. Now, let us talk a little bit about how, when we talk about the politics of international relations, how exactly that unravels, right? And I'll let my colleague Mengge talk a little about that for a second before we continue.
Yes, thank you, Herman. Can we go to, okay. So in our study, we measured how the Chinese investments influence African countries' political alignment with China as well as US. So in order for us to measure political alignment, first, we have to have a measure of the overall political preference of a country. So the measure that we use is called ideal points. So this is a index of a country's foreign policy preference based on how they vote in the United Nations. So this is a concept that's developed by political scientists to measure overall the political preference of a person, of a group, or of a country. So an example here is given on the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in UN. So the ideal point ranges somewhere between -3 to +3. A higher number indicates that this country's political preference is more aligned with the liberalism ideology. And the negative number, the lower the number, it indicates that this country's overall political preference is further away from the liberalism ideology. So here we can see that the United States is very high on the scale. UK and France, they're very much aligned with each other, and they're also high on the scale. But Russia and China, they're down on the scale. They have a lower score. And indeed, since the 80s, Russia has an increase in their ideal point, which means that they become much more liberal during that period of time. And they drop a little bit after the early 90s, but then they stabilize. For China, okay. For China, they increase a little bit since the 80s, but then the 90s, they decrease and then stabilize. So based on these ideal points, we can now measure the alignment in terms of the political preference between two countries. So here we have the ideal point similarity between the African countries and China before and after 2008. So on your left-hand side, that's the overall political alignment between all the African countries and China before 2008. On the right-hand side is after 2008. And what we can see from here is that overall, a lot of the African countries, they become more politically aligned with China after 2008. And we also compare the similarity between the political alignment with China and with US. So on this scale, you see that it ranges from somewhere -3.5 to 0. So when we look at the ideal point similarity at 0 means that they're perfectly aligned, means that their voting patterns are very similar to each other. And the more negative, the lower the numbers, that means that their voting patterns are more misaligned with each other. So the blue line here is the similarity between Africa and China, and we can see that they're very much aligned over the years. There are some variations over the years, but overall they're very, very small numbers, which means that they're closely aligned. And the orange line here is the similarity between Africa and US. And we can see that there's a big misalignment here because the numbers are all on the lower end. So we then analyze the effects of Chinese investments on whether or not that will increase or decrease the political alignment between Africa and China. What you're seeing here is the effects of the investment from China in both FDI and loans on the change in political alignment between Africa and China. So the blue bar here indicates the effects of FDI, and the orange bars here are the effects on loan. We can see that between 2001 to 2007, there's no effects, but between 2008 and 2012, both FDI and loans have significant effects. So if you invest, which means that the investment from China in either FDI or loan will lead to an increase of political alignment between Africa and China. And between 2013 and 2019, there's no effect on FDI, but still there's an effect on loan. So the loan still has a effect on the political alignment, but the FDI does not have effect after 2012. And this graph shows you the political, the effects of Chinese investments on the political alignment with United States. So this is the other side of the picture. And we can see that between 2008 and 2012, the loan from China has a negative relationship with the political alignment with United States. So what it means is that the loan investments from China, they decrease the political alignment between Africa and United States. And we also see that on average, overall, the FDI also has a negative effect on the political alignment with United States. So overall, our analysis show that the investments from China in either FDI or loan, they increase Africa countries' political alignment with China, while also decrease their alignment with United States.
Thank you, Mengge. So to kind of summarize the discussion so far, or at least the findings so far, we see that post 2008 economic engagement, Chinese economic engagement in Africa really leads to increased alignment. And we really didn't discuss the details of the analysis here, but this is taking into consideration the economics, all the other drivers. And this is also controlling for all the other investments, right? The US FDI, the European FDI, just to be sure that there are no extraneous effects. We find that there really is a window of opportunity here. When we look at 2008 to 2012, likely caused obviously by the Great Depression, there is a loose tangling of international relations, which gives China the opportunity to have a greater, we can call it greater bang for its buck, right? Significantly, and we can, if we translate, and I'm going to try and go back a couple of slides, just so we can translate. If we translate what we see for 2008, it essentially here means that $1 billion in investment in FDI leads to 24%. This is about 24% increase in voting alignment with China. That is the change, 24% increase in alignment. For loans, it's 19%. Right now, post 2012, this drops to about 4% for loans and goes up to 6% over all the years. But during the key period of the Great Depression, there was a significant change. And that's, if you notice, a 24% increase just for each additional billion, it means it locks in a lot of relationships, right? Once that voting pattern starts, it becomes a little bit difficult to disentangle. Now, one possible explanation could be, well, the global politics are getting more aligned, right? And we know from anecdotal evidence that that's not the case, but you could make that argument. And that is why it becomes important to say, okay, how do we contrast this with the US? If it is getting more aligned, then you would see African countries also getting increasingly aligned with the US. But what we find is that they are getting increasingly disaligned, right, unaligned with the US. So Chinese investment is not only bringing African countries closer to China, but also taking them further apart from the US. Now, one part not really captured in the graphs is the fact that when we look at the governance mechanisms within Africa, we know more Abraham Foundation actually does a good job ranking the governance across countries. You see that the better governed countries are actually less susceptible for this influence than the not so well governed countries, right? So there's that caveat there, which would be something for interesting for another discussion, how that works. Especially why? Because there are two possible effects here. One, it is that, well, simply, if you're better governed, you are more in tune with the wishes of your population, and therefore less likely to be driven by foreign influence for world affairs. But the second explanation actually could be one of reverse causality, right? African countries that get more economic engagement from Africa, more money, more loans, are less accountable to their people, and there could be the possibility of more entrenchment. So while you get more money, no strings attached, you can use it to build your cabal, and nobody gets to answer any questions to anybody what they get to do with the money and how much they entrench themselves, or they pay their friends to buy support. Some broader implications we can take from this, though, is if we step back and look at this from a broader picture, Chinese economic engagement in Africa is really still a drop in the bucket, right? Literally, and I would say, and let me go to literally and figuratively, there is enough room in Africa for both China and the US, right? And literally and figuratively is shown in the map, but in the numbers also, right? If we think about economic engagement, 2019 numbers, I use that as an example. Chinese FDI only accounts for 10% of FDI in Africa. And I don't think anybody is going to make the case that investments in Africa are optimized, right? There's still, it's still a condition of under investment, right? So there is room for US to really still come in. And not only in terms of FDI or loans, but we think about it broadly across the range of economic engagement, right? Imports, exports, China still accounts for about 45 billion, which is about 18% for imports. US is about 16 billion, which is about 6%, right? Once again, room to grow on both sides. But that room for growth is declining. While there's opportunity for both, it is not everlasting, and time may be running out, right? And a good example for that is just between 2020 and 21, we don't yet have 2022 numbers to really plug in. Overall trade between China and Africa increased by 35%. So China is quickly catching up to that gap. Interestingly, though, it is not even, right? So when we look across this, we see that 54%, over half of this engagement from China actually goes to the top five partners, right? Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Angola, and DRC. Now, one thing you probably quickly notice among those is they contain two categories, market and resources, right? Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, three largest markets in Africa. Nigeria, Angola, DRC, largest extractives, right? So the economics still drives some of the fundamentals of the relationships, even though the relationship can be leveraged within the political flare. Finally, we should also think about the fact that despite the fact that we're really looking at this US-centric and China in Africa and thinking about its implications for the US, it is important, at least for US policy, to step back and think about US policy about Africa to be more about Africa and less about China, right? And being guilty actually of this same criticism, given the nature of this discussion, a lot of what we look at, the US looks at when it looks at Africa, is it doesn't see Africa, it sees a sphere of influence over which it can battle China and Russia, less so Russia, more so China, right? And if we look at the current report, I would say current strategy for Africa, it was put about 2018 or so that it came out. And the forward by then on the Secretary of State Bolton focused, that strategy was focused on China and Russia, right? Then Undersecretary and Mr. Undersecretary, I suspect you probably might be in the audience, so I apologize if I misquote you, but his preamble to Congress in presenting that report on the new US strategy to Africa, once again, it focuses on Africa as the context to counter China and Russia. And you look further into that document, right? I believe China and Russia are mentioned about 55 to 60 times. But Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, the 3 largest economies in Africa are not mentioned in the US strategy for Africa, right? So maybe thinking about it more as Africa being Africa and less being a sphere or context of influence might actually help. Finally, we sometimes focus too much on the past, right? With some of this analyzing the past, and we want to project a little into the future. When we think about how we leverage economics, you become an economic power as China has become. Then you think about, oh, this gives me political power. Then what is the next step, right? We can think about it as the third leg to the stool, and likely military leverage. If you think economic, political, we suspect going forward, especially as US interests are concerned, it will not be far-fetched to see China leveraging economic engagement into security sphere. And as we were actually doing this a couple of months ago, rumors came about that China was looking at putting a military base in Bata, right? Bata is right there in Equatorial Guinea. Now, it's rumors, but it must have been true, or there must have been something to it, because the Undersecretary for Africa made a quick trip to Equatorial Guinea a couple of months ago. So maybe, and all declaration, I have no classified information. Nobody classifies me as anything. So I'm just giving public information here. So I don't know anything about whether or not it is true. But yes, you could see that as the next phase. So from a US-centric perspective, the economic power was leveraged into political power without any US implications, or without the US really thinking seriously about it. But I do think that when we start looking forward, going to the third stool where security concerns come about, that really rises up a notch, right? And if we think this is trivia, if there is a military base there, that would be the first potentially hostile military base with direct access to all of the US Eastern Seacoast. Right, straight, if you can see the small part of that, I think most of us can visualize the world map. That's the Atlantic, and that takes us all to the eastern US seaboard unabated, right? So it's not necessarily a trivial security concern. So some concluding thoughts before we open it up for questions and discussions. Current US policy, to some extent, generally sits the future of African relations to China. There is room for growth. There is room generally for US policy to catch up, especially based on the goodwill that exists within the continent, but the time for that also might be running out. Future-wise, we should think about some of the security ramifications. We've talked about the economic, we've talked about the political, but there is likely to be future ramifications security-wise. Future-wise also, and this is just throwing out that I suspect if FPRI is doing this, if we're doing this 10 years from now, the likely topic of the discussion will not be Chinese economic engagement in Africa. It will be likely be Chinese immigrant engagement in Africa, right? Which is another sphere that is really cropping up. It is a little bit below the radar right now, but a lot of the new economic engagement in Africa is not really as much government directed as much it is immigrant Chinese entrepreneurs directed. And, you know, interesting discussion for another day, the class of immigrants and entrepreneurs from China to Africa, they're quite distinct, not the least of which is a good number. They actually hold some hostilities towards the Chinese government, right? Or towards the Chinese structure of doing things. So that may be an interesting future to look at, because increasingly they're accounting for more and more of the economic engagement, which would give a pathway to disengaging economic engagement from political power, political influence, especially when that economic engagement is not driven by parties, in this case, the immigrants, whose interests align with those of the government. So I will stop right there. I think we've talked for what, close to 35 minutes or so, 40. So we can have ample time for questions, discussions, but I'll probably let Ambassador Ray go first to open it up, and then we can go from there. And I would actually end the slideshow So stop sharing so we can all be visible, but the slides are available to reference if we need it for any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The very, very informative presentation and gives us a lot to think about and plan for future programs. I think your final comment there is worth taking a look at before it becomes an issue. But I have a couple of questions I would like to ask. We talked about the post-2019 period, but given the current world condition with Russia's actions in Ukraine and Russia's growing relationship with China, which has put the Chinese in something of an uncomfortable position right now in that they risk a lot of their economic engagement in other parts of the world by being too closely tied to Russia. How does the China-Russia relationship impact China's actions in Africa?
Great question, right? And when you are in uncomfortable situations, that's when you need good friends, right? And coming President Ramaphosa, right, of South Africa, guess who has stepped up to mediate between Russia and Ukraine? That takes a bit of the heat of China. Right. Now, of course, as a side note, it would be quite helpful if the president of South Africa really starts a little bit with helping with some of the conflicts in Africa. Once again, a different discussion. But you can see where friends help out in the political field. And I believe South Africa has been quite helpful in taking the hit of China, in stepping up and being the focal point for potential negotiations, whether or not they are a pawn in the negotiations or actually a potential mediator is a different question, but it takes some of the heat off China, right? So what I see here is the implications here somewhat is I see China pushing a bit on South Africa, supporting South Africa to step up as a potential mediator, such that takes the heat off them. But the second aspect also becomes how much the Ukraine crisis, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, realigns world politics. And I don't know if I have the expertise to answer to that. What I do know, at least from the Afrocentric perspective, looking at it from the Afrocentric perspective, is I do think that it highlights a lot the disparities in the attention conflicts get, in the support in resolving the conflicts they get across, whether it's in Africa or in this case in Europe. And I think if you look within the continent, that is where the discussion has mostly focused, just in the disparities in attention and resources devoted to ending the conflict. And I know that did not exactly answer your question, but it kind of scattered around it anyway.
Well, you actually answered it fairly well under the circumstances, but you also gave me another thought, and that is, you mentioned in your conclusions that our policy, the U.S. policy, should be focused on Africa rather than on China's or Russia's presence in Africa, and that is a good point. You pointed out, for example, that the last official Africa policy mentioned China and Russia dozens of times and failed to mention even once some of the larger economies on the continent. What are some of the practical things that you think should be included in an overarching policy toward Africa on the part of the U.S. to sort of mediate this or to alleviate this impression that the only reason we care about Africa is because other people are there?
Okay, I will attempt at two, but I'll also leave it at my colleagues to think of others. So I'll start off with two while they think. The first is simple, right? The US is a free economy, but government policy still drives a lot of economic decisions. And I think just like we had with AGOA, although I think AGOA was sold a little short, I think the US could really think about ways in which it encourages American businesses to actively invest and engage in the continent, right? A simple example would be utilizing the Exim Bank, for example, to spare development outside of extractives. I may say it is utilized a little bit too much for extractives, but I'll say outside of extractives, it's where you get to meet and interact with a lot of the people. And for no other reason, if you look at it simply economic-wise, is, you know, Sub-Saharan Africa is slated to have, what, 40% or so of the world's population by 2050. So that's where most of the fastest growing economies are. So it just makes sense future-wise. So that is one. The second, I think, and we did not discuss there, but the analysis actually shows where you get the greater bang for your buck. The US does spend a bit military-wise in Africa, right? But if you look at the spending military-wise versus spending economic-wise, you find that spending economic-wise gives you more friends. Spending military-wise doesn't necessarily give you friends, right? Unfortunately, we don't have numbers for Chinese military expenditure, but I don't think they're anywhere close to the US, but you could see alignment with China growing with economic engagement. At the same time, US, and I think by 2019, it was somewhere around 160-something billion military expenditure in Africa, but alignment dropping, right? So I think we have to think about ways in which the US thinks about more ways. The money is there, the money is being invested, put in, right? But probably not in the most useful in terms of developing friends and friendly relationships with the people in the continent. So maybe shifting from more military to economic might be preferential, but I'll leave it to my colleagues also to see if they have something to add in.
Okay. So something that we've talked about previously is just the knowledge of the continent and the countries that exist in Africa by American people. There is a great, vast, I guess, lack of knowledge and insight on Africa. So I think that one of the things could be greater investment from the US in understanding the nuances and the characteristics of Africa and the African culture. Some of that can be done through partnerships with universities. In addition, some way to what Ambassador Ray has talked about, making the American people knowledgeable about Africa. Until we become knowledgeable about Africa, then our elected officials, it won't be a priority for them. But because of our lack of knowledge, we don't put the responsibility on our elected officials. And I think there's just such a disconnect and lack of exposure that almost we need to increase the insights and knowledge from the ground up. And then that would help the American people to become aware of the benefits of the continent, of the countries in Africa, as well as the resources and other things that may align with our interests, so that it's not this great unknown or this scary place that we have lack of information about.
Yes, and one additional thing I think we notice in our analysis is that there are huge heterogeneities across different countries in Africa. So I think that the implication is that it's better for us to not to treat Africa as one coherent entity, but to see it as 54 different countries, and each of them is different and unique. So when in policy making, we have to really understand what's the unique things about each country. And so we can do things that can specifically benefit each country.
Thank you. One other question, and then we'll go to the audience. You talked about governance, and if I heard you correctly, you seem to be implying that the increase in investment might, not definitely was, but might account for some of the poor governance, because this increase of unrestricted, unqualified investment from China empowers autocrats and helps them to stay in power. And going back to your comment that we should find ways to encourage more U.S. investment. I mean, you mentioned Exim Bank, but beyond Exim Bank, what can the U.S. do to make it more attractive for American companies to invest in Africa, to sort of shift that calculus a little so that there is an investment that contributes to better governance and to more benefits for the people rather than entrenched political interests?
Thanks. I think the first would be probably, I would say, expanding something like AGOA. So if you think about a lot of US investment still brings products back into the US for market. So if you think about building manufacturing capacity across different areas of the continent, that becomes a lot more attractive to businesses if there are tariff concessions, for example, for importing those back into the US. Right. So if US companies are given the incentive, if you build manufacturing facilities or production facilities or invest even in agriculture in Africa, you get tariff concessions to sell in the US. That would be, I believe, a very strong driver for that. And I believe with such investments, when we think about across the world, growing middle class in general helps liberalize economies and political systems, right? Unfortunately, especially in Africa, although there has been some growing middle class, the growing middle class has been a little thwarted, especially in the more centralized economies, by what we call the civil service system. Because if the middle class is essentially dominated by individuals subservient to the system, to the government, then that increase in economic power will not necessarily open up the government. But if it comes from the commercial sector, then it is likely to open up the government, because once again, with greater economic means, you're more likely to demand greater political freedom. I think the second tied to that is, and this is where we start thinking about the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank, is the reality is, although they claim to tie a lot of the economic concessions they give to governance issues, the reality is on the ground, you rarely see any change. So it's almost invariably on paper, right? So it might just be a question of enforcement. You know, you can say, oh, the IMF gave, you know, I mean, let me cite an example that I think is current in my mind, right? World Bank gave, I think, approximately 200 million in COVID relief to Cameroon. Comes back a year later and says, well, most of it was embezzled. But 2 months later gives 400 million in economic concessions, right, in loans. So that if there are no repercussions for utilizing it, but it's just statements. So yes, Western investment loans come with strings attached, but it's just on paper. It is not tied to actually any implementation. So we need to take it a step further to say, well, we actually have to hold these governments accountable rather than simply saying we hold them accountable. And that may actually lead to some real changes, and the real changes would hopefully open up the economies and the peoples a lot more.
Yeah, and I would just say, excuse me, for the US too, as Mengge had said, that we don't look at Africa as a continent, but pursue more trade agreements with individual countries that would be beneficial to both countries, and then enforce and use those trade agreements so that we find a benefit for both countries, for the US and the particular African country. And maybe start with countries that we believe have a stronger government.
Professor Li, you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't have any additional comments on that.
Okay, well, I have one more question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And that is, we've talked about US-China competition in Africa, and how it's really been sort of one-sided with China scoring more points than we have. But what about the potential for, and the areas for US-China cooperation in Africa on those issues that impact us both? For example, climate change or the destabilizing impact of extremist movements. What's your take on how that could be used to mitigate some of the impacts of this competition? Or is that
okay?
Everyone.
Well, no, okay, I'll go. I think you have answered the question, right? It's good. I think security steps us first, and where there's been some areas, if you look at the Horn of Africa, has largely been stabilized a lot due to US-China cooperation. The piracy areas, you have something similar in West Africa, although I'm not sure how much the Chinese are helping with that. But security there, the spread of extremism threatens everybody, whether it's on the African continent or everywhere. And I think that is probably one area there is for cooperation. I think the second, it is going to be very difficult to see where in terms of resources there is cooperation, because just by the given nature, what I get is what you don't get. But once again, in terms of policies towards climate change, you mentioned that really is, it would take, I will not say a leap, but it would really take a lot of effort to build that, just because of the trade-off, right? If you look at like areas of the forest that need preservation, if you look at areas where there is desert encroachment that needs mitigating factors, they are highly correlated with also areas that have high levels of extractives that people want to take out or have incentives of taking out, right? Where it, unfortunately, that trade-off with preservation versus extracting, or how you extract even, makes it a lot more difficult for potential cooperation. But one thing I may note that is very optimistic is, I think that if we look, it's not included in the analysis, but if we look at the last 3 years, we see a distinct shift in how Chinese engage. Let's use the loans, for example. The no strings attached is almost being thrown out. China is beginning to hold countries more accountable for their loan repayment. And it is realizing, therefore, that better governance, certain factors account for longer relationships, better relationships, than simply just giving the money and hoping. So we can see, if we look, and this is anecdotal, not enough time for it to see, we can see the past probably 2-3 years that countries are being held to almost the same standards, at least as they speak. China is beginning to hold countries to somewhat the same standards as the West in terms of accountability for at least the utilization of the funds, right? That is becoming more and more apparent, which is where you can see where interest can align to say, okay, it is in everybody's interest, for example, not to encourage corrupt regimes, not to encourage repressive regimes, because in the long run, it's not good for economics or politics anyway, for both these regimes, or for both the US and China. So that is one area in the long run where hopefully there could be more cooperation, right? I mean, we saw, I think, the case of Zambia that defaulted just because of the lack of the ability of the Paris Club and China to talk over terms of renegotiating the debt, right? And that, I think, hopefully we haven't seen a reoccurrence of that, which means that it is becoming increasingly clear that cooperation works better than, I suppose, animosity in those cases. Yeah, I'm sorry, Carla, you were going to add something.
Well, I want to leave time for a question or two, so I'll just echo. I think what Herman said is true. It's going to take a lot of selfless engagement from the US and China, if that's possible. And I think climate change would be a perfect place to start, but it's not. We can't just put climate change in a silo. It's going to affect other aspects of interaction between countries.
Right. Thank you. Absolutely. I totally agree. First question from the audience, and this segues from what we were just talking about. Do you see debt trap diplomacy being carried out by China in Africa?
The straightforward answer
like a
is
somewhat
no.
Loaded question.
Yes,
okay.
It's a loaded question. And no here being that, if we, depending on how you define debt trap, right? Intentionally entrapping somebody, then holding them hostage. I think so far we haven't seen anybody cry hostage yet. there is no question that the strategy has been, something we didn't mention, post-2012, if you notice, China moved more from FDI towards loans. It might be the same deals, but how you put them in the books matter. And the thing with loans is the terms become more and more obscure. And it's essentially secret, right? What some of the terms are and the paper, which makes it very difficult to find empirical evidence of the trap. But we're still watching. There have been 1 or 2 instances of potential default. More so rumors. I know everybody was a few months ago. Everybody was the talk was it Uganda? Was it Kampala airport or one of the East African countries' airports was about to be seeded, but it turns out not to be true. So we have to step back a little to see what has actually occurred versus what is rumored to potentially occur. And what has actually occurred, the answer will be no. We haven't seen any hostage taking yet.
However, we should understand that loans are written in the favor of the entity providing the loan. So it's always going to be that way. And so we need to keep that in mind also.
It's called the golden rule. He with the gold makes the rules.
Exactly.
Next question. Is it accurate to say that Chinese workers who go to Africa to work on infrastructure stay behind and engage in importing cheap Chinese goods to the detriment of local businesses?
Okay, that is a loaded 3-part question. So let's break it up into the 3 parts. First, do workers stay behind? In general, yes, not all of them, right? So yes, there's been the trend to see that some of the workers that go in stay behind. But the question should be less towards the Chinese and more towards the African governments, right? If you negotiate these deals, you should be negotiating for local provision of certain services, right? So I think the problem there is with the local, with the countries, not the Chinese government. The second is, do their presence lead to greater import of Chinese materials depressing the local market? And that is a tough one to answer, because to answer that, you would have to say without their presence, would Chinese goods not be imported?
Yeah.
And I don't know that that is the case. The third, which is quite interesting, is what we find is more of the immigration now is less the workers. So I would say 15 years ago, it was more the workers. But what has happened right now is the secondary, tertiary effects of that. A lot of the immigration is not the workers, but extended family members, friends, and who have seen the economic opportunity, right? And they migrate because they know that there's economic opportunity in the continent, which with their ties back home in China, they can capitalize on. So the wave of migration now is not the workers. The largest is, but relatives, extended family, friends, the network of the migrants 10, 15 years ago, right? And that is why I say there are lots of caveats there. Yes. But once again, I think what that goes to highlight is the presence of economic opportunity. And it says, if one person is taking advantage of an opportunity, is it necessarily at the detriment of another person? Or is the opportunity there for anybody who wants to take advantage of, right? And that is an open question. And I suppose it's a question for local politicians also. But I think one of the things we want to step away from, it is always easy for local politicians to abdicate their responsibility by pointing at the immigrants to say, oh yeah, they're the ones taking your jobs. And I don't think we want to jump into that tendency without full empirical evidence of what the implications might be.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very useful presentation. I apologize to those in the audience whose questions we haven't had a chance to get to, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks very much to our 3 panelists who, by the way, are Templeton Fellows with FPRI. I hope we will be seeing more of them in the coming months. Thank you again for joining us. On behalf of President Raleigh Flynn of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and thank you for your continued support.
Yes, thank you. Great
Thank you,
discussion.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.